The Hamas attack on Israel was a real turning point in the Palestinian conflict. The West threw themselves behind Israel as rarely before. Support was practically unanimous. Since then, however, as the war has spread and sparked other conflicts, such as the one in the Red Sea, a new idea has been germinating. This time, the conflict cannot end without results. In other words, this never-ending story must be settled once and for all.
UK could recognize Palestinian state before any deal with Israel, says David Cameron. France's Macron opens door to recognizing Palestinian state.
Indeed, Western countries would be opening up to the recognition of the Palestinian state. And if you don't believe me, look at what Matthew Miller, Uncle Sam's State Department spokesman, has said.
I believe that this conflict, as all conflicts do, will end at some point, and that there needs to be a political path forward for the establishment of a Palestinian state. That is the only way, not just to answer the legitimate hopes, dreams, aspirations of the Palestinian people, but it is also, and this is critical, the only way to provide lasting security for the Israeli people.
Of course, this is much easier said than done. And on VisualPolitik, in this and in future videos, we will tell you in detail how an effective solution to this conflict could be found, if it is really feasible. But once again, it won't be easy. Remember that the creation of a genuine Palestinian state would require that the Palestinian authorities be sovereign, that they be able to decide on their own borders, their trade policy, their foreign relations, and above all, their security. And VisualPolitik community, therein lies a problem. In 2005, Israel withdrew completely from the Gaza Strip, and since then, the territory has basically been an independent state. Israel pulled out its troops, its security teams, and also its settlers. The withdrawal was total. Yet, 18 years later, far from seeing an emerging, peaceful, and prosperous territory, Gaza has remained on a war footing with Israel to this day. The authorities in the Strip were more preoccupied with developing their military plans than in pursuing the economic and political development of the area. And this has led Israeli politicians to ask themselves a critical question. Why on earth would we think that the creation of a genuine, sovereign, and independent Palestinian state would have a different outcome? Even more so, considering that the most radical factions in Palestine have never given up fighting for the elimination of the neighboring state of Israel. Well, this is exactly what even the words of the former Palestinian Prime Minister reflect. Check it out.
They will never eradicate Hamas because it's one of their official goals.
Of course not, because Hamas is not only in Gaza. Yes, and Hamas is an idea, is not only a military structure or an organization in Gaza.
Even so, the war is bringing back to the table the imperative need to find a way out of this never-ending conflict once and for all. Civilian casualties, images of war, the threat of the conflict spreading, and the possibility, even, that it could end up provoking a full-scale war with Iran, Hezbollah, Syria, and the Houthis has caused Western backing for Israel to begin to unravel. In other words, between the Israeli offensive, the incipient humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and the first clashes between Benjamin Netanyahu and the Biden administration, the flag of the Palestinian state has finally been raised again.
We believe in a two-state solution, a secure Israel within its borders and a secure and stable Palestine within its borders. That's long been our position. And of course, as part of that, Britain, along with other countries, would recognize Palestine as a country and recognize Palestine at the United Nations.
And take note, because things are also moving within the Palestinian sphere. On February 26th, Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh resigned from his post, leaving an important message.
I see that the next stage and its challenges require new governmental and political arrangements that take into account the new reality in Gaza and the need for an inter-Palestinian consensus based on Palestinian unity and the extension of the unity of authority over the land of Palestine. Mohammed Shtayyeh, Prime Minister of Palestine until 26 February 2024.
The fact is that all this has made us here on VisualPolitik ask ourselves a few questions. What is the US thinking, and what exactly would be the plan to achieve an effective Palestinian state once and for all? Is this really possible? And what would be the consequences for the Middle East? Well, we're going to see all this and more in this video. Now, fasten your seatbelts, step on the gas, and let's get started. In theory, Palestine has its own formal government, and has had since 1994, when the Oslo Accords created the Palestinian Authority of the West Bank, today known as the Palestinian National Authority. The idea is that this institution would take over the civil administration and, little by little, would also take over security in the cities, as well as in the rest of the Palestinian territory. As you all know, since 1994, it was controlled by Fatah, Yasser Arafat's party. However, the joy of the agreements was short-lived. The new model of Palestinian governance finally collapsed in 2006 when the political wing of Hamas swept the elections and took control of the Palestinian parliament. Hamas won 74 of the 132 seats, and from then on, the dream of a genuine Palestinian state came to a screeching halt. The international community threatened to suspend foreign assistance if Hamas took control, and as a result, democracy in Palestine collapsed. The Palestinians had the option to vote, but in the end, opted for Hamas, a radical group with a terrorist arm. The result? Elections were suspended. The parliament lost its vote. And in 2007, after heavy fighting, Hamas took control of Gaza by force, expelled the Palestinian National Authority, and established its own government. Since then, and until now, Palestine has been split in two. All this caused Israel to lose any confidence in an amicable solution to the conflict. After all, while Fatah is a political party that has recognized the right of the State of Israel to exist since 1988, Hamas is the opposite. Hamas wants to eliminate the Israeli state. And why do Palestinian citizens prefer Hamas to Fatah? Well, in large part because they consider Fatah to be a tremendously corrupt party and very collaborative with Israel. The result? Well, even despite the 7th of October attack and the subsequent war in Gaza, Hamas remains far more popular among Palestinians. In a poll conducted at the end of December, more than 40% of Palestinians still favored Hamas, compared to less than 20% who favored Fatah. And remember, we are not referring exclusively to Gaza, but to all of Palestine. In fact, Hamas is more popular in the West Bank than in Gaza itself, where other, even more radical political forces have more support. So now the tough question: how can a genuine Palestinian state be created if the political force most supported by the Palestinians themselves is the very one that Israel wants to destroy? How could Israel trust a Palestine ruled by Hamas, an organization that seeks Israeli annihilation? Well, let's take a look.
A clean slate?
Whether we support Israel or not, one thing is clear. More and more voices in the West are questioning the retaliation and the level of the Israeli offensive in Gaza. Virtually all Western governments are saying that it is going too far, and they are not referring exclusively to military action.
Biden condemns settler attacks against Palestinians in the West Bank. France bans 28 Israeli settlers over West Bank violence.
Attacks by extremist settlers have been denounced even by Netanyahu himself.
Netanyahu warned that extremist settler attacks could lead to escalation in the West Bank.
And the fact is that a good number of these attacks by out-of-control settlers are taking place in the West Bank. And not surprisingly, the risk is that these attacks could end up provoking a huge spiral of violence in the only Palestinian territory that is somewhat stable. This could extend the conflict and then, indeed, end any chance of building a Palestinian state. Because while the Palestinians overwhelmingly support Hamas, a party that wants to destroy the Hebrew state, in Israel, the parties of the two-state solution are collapsing. In fact, from religious Zionism, which, remember, is a political bloc that is part of Netanyahu's own government, there is open talk of the annexation of Palestine and the dismantling of any institution that it has. Then, there are also those who support maintaining the status quo indefinitely, which is precisely Netanyahu's own position. That is, that things remain as they have been in recent decades. A Palestinian national authority riddled with interventions and with little practical ability to function, while the Israel Defense Force continues to be in charge of keeping any threat at bay at all costs. The problem with either of these two alternatives is that they are virtually incompatible with Palestinian development and the eradication of the problem. These days, Palestinians have many limitations. For example, in trading with the outside world, there are not as many as is often claimed, but they do exist. Eternal roadblocks and the lack of fast and direct connections between various Palestinian cities also make economic activity very difficult. And let's not talk about foreign direct investment or the lack of infrastructure. And of course, without any of that, it is very difficult to escape from this type of spiral of hatred, frustration, resentment, and violence. Precisely for this reason, the Western powers, and also the Arab countries, continue to insist on the two-state model. In fact, you all know that Netanyahu is working on normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia. Well, this seems to be the result of advancing precisely this solution. Take a look.
And while the kingdom fully recognizes the need for Israel to feel safe, it cannot be at the expense of the Palestinian people. The solution is obvious and the solution is now. And the solution is a two-state solution.
This would perhaps be the formula for overcoming the social reticence that still exists towards the recognition of Israel among the Arab populations. But of course, the question is, how would this process be carried out, especially to ensure possible Israeli security misgivings? Well, there are several proposals up for discussion. For example, the Center for a New American Security, a think tank linked to the Democratic Party, has presented a possible roadmap. According to this approach, the new Palestinian state would be composed of 4 mutually reinforcing layers of security. Take a look. First, we would have a non-militarized Palestinian force, which would serve as a kind of civil guard to take care of public security matters. This layer would be 100% Palestinian. Secondly, a border security system would be established, where the Palestinian police would work together with Jordanian and Egyptian forces to maintain control of its borders with the other 2 Arab countries. The third layer would be focused on controlling the air and maritime space of the Palestinian territories. Of course, we are talking about air and maritime surveillance systems. In this case, Saudi Arabia and the other countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council would be responsible for this system. And finally, the last layer of security and response would be established where Israel, the new Palestinian state, the United Nations, Saudi Arabia, and other Gulf Cooperation Council countries could work together to confront terrorist groups such as Hamas. This is just one example of many that we can find. And obviously, all these options would be linked to the eradication of Hamas.
A number of steps would have to be taken to make that happen, including the Hamas leaders leaving Gaza effectively, because you can't have a two-state solution with Gaza still controlled by the people responsible for October the 7th.
In this way, according to the international community, the establishment of a truly independent Palestinian state would make it possible to create stronger institutions and promote economic development, which they believe would reduce the support that currently exists for terrorist groups such as Hamas or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Now, is it really feasible for Israel to accept this solution? Well, let's be honest, it's not going to happen. After the attack against Israel, that option seems, and I'm sorry to say it because here on VisualPolitik we have long supported it, completely ruled out. What can I say? These days it seems more likely that Putin will apologize for the invasion of Ukraine than that the Israeli government will accept a Palestinian state.
ישראל דוחה על הסף תכתיבים בינלאומיים בעניין הסדר הקבע עם הפלסטינים. הסדר כזה יושג אך ורק במשא ומתן ישיר בין הצדדים, ללא תנאים מוקדמים. ישראל תוסיף להתנגד להכרה חד-צדדית במדינה פלסטינית.
And keep in mind that we are not only talking about the rejection of politicians and the government. The truth is that, as I said earlier, the majority of Israelis are also against it. Specifically, 63% of Jewish Israelis oppose the establishment of a Palestinian state. And if we ask them about the possibility of creating a Palestinian national authority that is much more effective and aligned with the West, then the pessimism is almost total. More than 80% of Israelis consider it unlikely. In other words, pessimism in Israel about the future of Palestine is overwhelming. Even Arab Israelis, who are overwhelmingly in favor of creating a Palestinian state, do not consider it likely that such a state would be viable. They support its creation, but take it for granted that it would be a disaster on a day-to-day basis. And so the Palestinian state's option would have many problems. It is not clear that this would curb the most radical groups, control corruption, or create effective institutions, or even simply achieve real political cohesion between two territories, the West Bank and Gaza, which have increasingly less in common and will never have straightforward communications. But we will talk about that in future videos here on VisualPolitik, where we will tell you exactly what plans Israel has for the future of Gaza, and where we will also study other possible ways out of this conflict, because one thing is clear: a way out can always be found. Although the truth is that the two-state solution, no matter how much the international community insists, seems very distant. Don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with everything we are talking about. But for now, let's get to the most important part of this video, the final questions that are yours to answer. Do you support the two-state solution? Can you think of any other alternative? How would you settle this conflict? Leave us your opinion in the comments and let's start a debate. Don't forget to like the video if you found it interesting. Thank you so very much for watching. All the best, and I will see you next time.